14 years ago, I was on a big trip and I spent some time exploring French Polynesia. I was a newly qualified diver and I'd been enjoying exploring the underwater world, but it hadn't yet entirely stopped me in my tracks. Not yet. One evening, someone told me about a giant manta ray they'd seen feeding quite close to the surface, not far from the beach nearby. So I went along to where it had been seen and I walked out on this wooden platform out over the water towards some huts that stood on stilts in the sea. Not more than 20 steps from the beach, there it was. This magnificent ocean creature swooping and flying in these massive, graceful circles underwater as it fed off the plankton that was attracted to the underwater light beneath me. It was out of this world. Less than a metre away, an ocean monster, a giant manta ray, just doing its thing. I was mesmerised and I lay on the platform and watched it and watched it. It was endless and amazing. Eventually, I remembered I had a dive mask in my bag, and so I slipped into the water next to it and floated and swam as it fed. I very much had the feeling that it wouldn't bother to try and avoid me if I got in its way. And while it's a filter feeder and wouldn't want to actually eat me, it had a mouth big enough for me to get stuck in and a rhythm and a purpose I wasn't going to get in the way of. I probably floated there for about an hour, and in that hour, I felt like I was between two worlds. I wasn't at depth with artificial lungs and a lot of hefty kit, but I wasn't on land and completely separate from that world either. That sense of connectedness and otherness at one and the same time was very real for me, and always has been whenever I've since delved into the underwater world. The thing about sea monsters is we think they're big and inherently bad and dangerous, but really we don't know. And if we can get past that initial and perhaps instinctive fear, that other world they can connect us to can be fascinating and liberating. So what about our own personal sea monsters? The creatures or the shadows that roam our inner depths, out of sight and perhaps out of mind too a lot of the time. Maybe you've never seen yours up close. Or maybe you've already spent a lot of time getting to know yours and exploring their world. Our monsters are often unknown, and because they're also unseen, can seem intimidating and dangerous because we don't know what they look like, and because we often live in worlds completely disconnected from them. But have you ever thought about the benefits of getting a closer look and getting to know your monsters? And though it might not feel natural, what might be the consequences of hiding or avoiding them? There are lots of different processes that allow our monsters to emerge, and for everyone it's something different. As an art therapist, I work with people to go beneath the surface and explore the deeper levels of themselves with the help of art materials and a creative therapeutic process. I worked with a client who I'll call Alex. Alex had been raped as a teenager, and ever since that time she'd fiercely worked to be in control and to protect herself from this earlier trauma that she'd suffered but pushed away, never having told anyone what happened. She came to art therapy when her super-controlled approach to life wasn't enough anymore to keep this earlier traumatic memory under control. She was being bullied at work by a very controlling man, and her sense of being overpowered by him echoed her previous sense of having been overpowered earlier on in her life. Her monster was re-emerging. This was a painful and intolerable experience for Alex, so she looked for help, either to push it away or to somehow acknowledge it and absorb it in some way on her own terms into her life. At first, we approached the monster without emotion. Alex insisted on being rational and technical, and this was a way of acknowledging but also pushing away at the same time, and a completely understandable approach to something she wanted to do, but she was also frightened of. Gradually, over time though, she realised there might be more to gain by having a closer look at her monster. And during a session about 3 months into our work together, she made an abstract image of her current experience of being bullied and her previous experience of having been raped. In this image, Alex is almost completely buried beneath larger blocks of colour, and it's an image that really frightened her. She had to physically put it away or turn it over in order to feel safe. In this image, Alex had manifested her monster. She'd authored it and she'd made it real, and so she'd begun the process of taking its power away and restoring her own. This meant we could start to work with the monster and engage in a more emotional as well as a rational way. But Alex remained very fearful of losing control and struggled to feel safe. So I guided her to a medium that was safe and fluid and gentle. Water became our tool. I'm going to show some images while I talk through this, but I just want to emphasise that they're not of actual client work, but rather of replicas I've made using the same process Alex and I were using. So what we did was we dripped and flicked watercolours and inks onto soaking wet sheets of paper. And the colours bled and merged and ran into a beautiful sort of gentle chaos. This was everything Alex tried to resist in her own life. There was no compartmentalisation or rigidity here. But the process allowed her to safely start to erode her barriers and to have a sense of what it felt like not to be in control. It was never wild or unmanageable or out of control, but it gave her a sense of freedom within the containment of the therapy sessions. There was a rhythm and a purpose to our work that neither of us stood in the way of. Alex ended up leaving her job and her bullying boss and feeling empowered to pursue a more meaningful life, less dominated by shapeless fears. The monster that she'd protected herself from for so long had become a part of herself that she could acknowledge, so it couldn't completely ambush her when reawakened by relationships or experiences. These creatures that we don't like to look at, or these experiences that are frightening or not understood, can be our most creative spaces too. In my own artwork as a sculptor, I'm exploring the beauty of these monsters. And when I make a jellyfish or a giant manta ray or a humpback whale, I'm bringing the feeling of my depths to the surface and making them tangible and shareable with the world. Evocative and connected to another state of being where movement's fluid and progressive. I read a book recently where the author describes the underwater world as operating in a liquid, graceful and weighty manner, like blood flows, not as synapses fire. And I love this description, that it's an experience where everything's moving in the same direction at the same time, and body and mind are encompassed as a whole, not sort of fractured off in different directions and demanding to be multitasked. And for me, we move forward when we bring our sea creatures to the surface, even if they do seem monstrous. Last year, I made a giant octopus, and I wrapped it around one of the light standards on Portobello Beach as part of Art Walk Porty. Half the time it was submerged beneath the rising tide, and half the time revealed. If it had been real, at this size, the octopus would have been a terrifying sea creature, but it was metal, solid and tangible and unreal. I want to share a short video clip of two children encountering the octopus on the beach.
It's dead! I think there's some sweat hiding. Should we try and touch it? Put it with your stick. And then let me out. Like me! Come on, send it. Let me touch it now. It's Homer!
It's the curiosity of what we would fear in real life that draws us to these creatures. And by bringing children and adults together with replicas of what they might fear, I'm trying to share some of the joy in daring to see what's there and finding beauty and meaning in the depths. When we let ourselves get to know and discover the creatures that live in our own depths, we can live fuller and more meaningful lives. Yes, it's possible to live completely disconnected from them and never suffer by it, but in those situations, are we really living the fullest lives we can imagine? Lives when our senses are filled and our hearts sing, and we really feel. And for some of us, avoiding looking at our monsters is futile because they're going to emerge anyway, whether we like it or not. So not only is it worth looking at what's in your depths for the pure adventure of it, but by untangling some of the tentacles of whatever it is that smothers us, we can be more liberated too. For some of us, discovering our depths will be about going to therapy. And for some of us, it will be about coming face to face with a completely other world that somehow connects to something in us. Whatever it is for you that lets you connect with all the different parts of yourself and shine a light on the things you don't already know. Give yourself a chance to explore and discover what's there. Whether it's running up a hill or swimming in the sea or cooking or writing or collecting leaves, give yourself the chance to really fill your senses and insist on having the space to allow things to emerge. Like my first experience with the manta ray, it's these moments that can form part of what make us whole. Thank you.